The year is 1964, and the Soviet Union stands at a crossroads. Nikita Khrushchev, the man who denounced Stalin and brought tanks to Budapest, who placed missiles in Cuba and pounded his shoe at the United Nations, has been removed from power in a bloodless palace coup. The men who orchestrated his downfall are tired of his erratic behavior, his constant reorganizations, his agricultural experiments that left store shelves empty, and, most of all, his unpredictability. They want stability. They want order. They want someone who will not rock the boat. On October 14, 1964, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Few outside the inner circles of the Kremlin understand what this transition will mean. Fewer still predict that this seemingly unremarkable bureaucrat will preside over the Soviet Union for the next 18 years, creating an era that will come to define both the apex and the beginning of the end of Soviet power. Brezhnev is not a revolutionary. He is not a theorist. He is not even particularly charismatic. Born in 1886 in Kamenskoye, Ukraine, in a working-class family, he rose through the party apparatus during Stalin's purges, benefiting from the vacuum created by the terror. He fought in World War II as a political commissar, earning medals and learning the language of Soviet patriotism. After the war, he climbed steadily through regional party positions in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, never making waves, always loyal, always careful. By the time he reaches the pinnacle of Soviet power, he is 57 years old, a product of the system, shaped by its rules, and entirely committed to its preservation. His mandate is simple: no more adventures, no more reforms that destabilize the bureaucracy, no more humiliations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev will be predictable, stable, and above all, secure. The first years of Brezhnev's rule are marked by what Soviet historians will later call collective leadership. Alexei Kosygin serves as premier, handling economic matters, while Nikolai Podgorny takes the largely ceremonial role of chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Brezhnev shares power, at least nominally, but he is patient and methodical. He understands the Soviet system better than anyone. He knows that power in the USSR does not come from grand gestures, but from controlling appointments, building networks of loyalty, and never threatening the privileges of the nomenklatura, the Soviet elite who run the ministries, the factories, the collective farms, and the security apparatus. Over the next 5 years, Brezhnev systematically consolidates his position. He places his allies in key positions. He rewards loyalty with dachas, with access to special stores where Western goods are available, with trips abroad, with the countless small privileges that make life in the Soviet Union bearable for those at the top. By 1970, Brezhnev is the undisputed leader, and the era that will bear his name has truly begun. The Brezhnev era is defined first and foremost by its economic contradictions. On paper, the Soviet economy in the late 1960s and early 1970s appears robust. Industrial output is growing. The Soviet Union is producing more steel, more oil, more coal, more cement than ever before. The USSR becomes the world's largest producer of crude oil by 1974, pumping over 9 million barrels per day. The discovery of vast oil and gas reserves in western Siberia creates a windfall that masks deeper structural problems. Brezhnev uses this petrodollar wealth to import grain from the West, to subsidize the economies of Eastern European satellite states, to fund military expansion, and to maintain a social contract with the Soviet people that promises stability and gradual improvement in living standards without demanding political freedom or genuine economic reform. But beneath the surface, The Soviet economy is ossifying. The command economy, which had successfully mobilized resources for industrialization and war, proves incapable of adapting to the demands of a modern, consumer-oriented society. The State Planning Committee, Gosplan, continues to set production targets based on quantity rather than quality. Factory managers meet their quotas by producing goods that no one wants or needs. A nail factory assigned to produce nails by weight produces enormous, useless nails. A chandelier factory produces chandeliers so heavy they cannot be hung from ordinary ceilings. The absurdities multiply across every sector of the economy. There is no incentive for innovation, no reward for efficiency, no mechanism for responding to consumer demand. The Soviet Union can launch satellites and build nuclear submarines, but it cannot reliably produce shoes that fit or televisions that work. Agriculture remains the Achilles heel of the Soviet system. Despite decades of collectivization and mechanization, the USSR cannot feed itself. The Virgin Lands campaign launched by Khrushchev has failed to produce sustainable yields. The collective farm system, with its lack of individual incentive and its bureaucratic inefficiency, results in chronic shortages and waste. Peasants maintain small private plots where they grow vegetables and raise livestock for their own consumption and for sale at farmers' markets. These private plots, occupying less than 3% of agricultural land, produce nearly a quarter of Soviet agricultural output. The contradiction is obvious but cannot be acknowledged. Instead, the Soviet Union becomes increasingly dependent on grain imports from the United States, Canada, and Argentina. In 1972, following a poor harvest, the USSR purchases 28 million tons of grain from the United States in what becomes known as the Great Grain Robbery, driving up world grain prices and causing food price inflation in America. For the average Soviet citizen, life under Brezhnev is a study in contradictions. There is near universal employment, but productivity is low and wages are modest. Housing is provided by the state, and millions move from communal apartments into individual flats in the massive concrete housing blocks that ring every Soviet city. These Khrushchevka and Brezhnevka apartments are small, poorly constructed, with thin walls and limited amenities. But they represent a significant improvement over the communal living arrangements of the Stalin era. Healthcare and education are free, and literacy rates are among the highest in the world. The Soviet Union produces more doctors and engineers per capita than almost any other nation. But the quality of healthcare is uneven, with access to better facilities dependent on one's position in the hierarchy. Special hospitals and clinics serve the nomenklatura, while ordinary citizens endure long waits, shortages of medicine, and outdated equipment. The consumer economy is characterized by perpetual shortage. There is money in people's pockets, but there is little to buy. Stores are often empty or stocked with goods of poor quality. To obtain desirable items, Soviet citizens must navigate a complex system of connections, known as blat. Knowing the right people, having access to the right networks, can mean the difference between obtaining a new refrigerator or a pair of decent shoes and going without. Queues become a defining feature of Soviet life. People queue for hours to buy basic necessities. When word spreads that a store has received a shipment of something desirable, queues form instantly. People join queues without even knowing what is being sold, on the assumption that anything worth queuing for is worth having. The joke circulates. A man sees a queue and joins it. He asks the person in front of him what they are queuing for. The reply, they say they're going to shoot someone. The man responds, I'll stay. Maybe it will be me. Yet there is also a sense of stability and predictability that many Soviet citizens appreciate, especially those who remember the chaos of the war and the terror of the Stalin years. The Brezhnev era is sometimes called the period of stagnation, but for many it is also a time of relative calm. The state provides a safety net. There is no unemployment, no homelessness, no fear of sudden arrest in the middle of the night. Crime rates are low, at least officially. The KGB remains omnipresent, but the mass terror of the Stalin era has ended. Dissidents are arrested, interrogated, sent to labor camps or psychiatric hospitals, but the scale of repression is far smaller. Most people learn to navigate the system, to avoid political topics, to express the required pieties in public while reserving their true opinions for private conversations with trusted friends. Culture under Brezhnev is tightly controlled, but not monolithic. The brief thaw under Khrushchev, which allowed the publication of Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and permitted limited artistic experimentation, is over. The regime reasserts ideological control. In 1966, the trial of writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel for publishing work abroad under pseudonyms signals the return to cultural orthodoxy. Both are sentenced to hard labor. The message is clear. The boundaries of acceptable expression have narrowed. Yet within these boundaries, Soviet culture continues to produce work of genuine quality. Soviet cinema produces films that become classics, though directors must navigate censorship and ideological demands. Andrei Tarkovsky creates visually stunning, philosophically complex films like Solaris in 1972 and Mirror in 1975, works that push the boundaries of Soviet cinema while avoiding overt political criticism. Soviet ballet and classical music maintain their world-class reputations. The Bolshoi and Kirov ballet companies tour internationally, serving as cultural ambassadors for the Soviet system. But for many intellectuals and artists, the stagnation is suffocating. A dissident movement emerges, small in numbers but significant in its moral courage. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who helped develop the Soviet hydrogen bomb, becomes the conscience of the dissident movement, speaking out for human rights and nuclear disarmament. In 1970, he co-founds the Committee on Human Rights in the USSR. The regime cannot simply arrest Sakharov because of his international stature, so it harasses him, restricts his movements, and eventually exiles him to the closed city of Gorky in 1980. Alexander Solzhenitsyn continues to write and to bear witness to the crimes of the Gulag. In 1973, the Gulag Archipelago is published in Paris, a devastating chronicle of the Soviet labor camp system. In February 1974, Solzhenitsyn is arrested, stripped of his Soviet citizenship, and deported to West Germany. The regime cannot tolerate his presence, but it also cannot silence his voice. Foreign policy under Brezhnev is defined by the pursuit of détente with the West and the assertion of Soviet dominance in the socialist bloc. The nuclear arms race continues, but both superpowers recognize the need to manage their rivalry to avoid catastrophic war. In May 1972, Brezhnev and President Richard Nixon signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, which limits the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems and freezes the number of intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. It is a modest agreement, but it represents a recognition that unlimited arms competition serves neither side. Trade between the Soviet Union and the West expands. The USSR imports Western technology and grain, paying with oil and gas revenues. European countries, particularly West Germany, develop increasingly close economic ties with the Soviet bloc, a relationship that will later be criticized as creating dangerous dependencies. But the pursuit of détente does not mean the abandonment of ideological competition or geopolitical ambition. The Brezhnev Doctrine articulated in the wake of the Prague Spring, asserts the Soviet Union's right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism is threatened. This doctrine is put into brutal practice in Czechoslovakia in August 1968, when Warsaw Pact forces invade to crush the reform movement, led by Alexander Dubček. Over 200,000 troops and 2,000 tanks enter Czechoslovakia. The reforms are reversed. Dubček is removed, and a period of normalization, meaning repression and ideological conformity, is imposed. The invasion sends a clear message to other Eastern European countries. There will be no deviation from the Soviet model, no socialism with a human face, no loosening of Moscow's control. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev also expands its influence in the Third World, supporting revolutionary movements and friendly regimes in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Soviet military advisors, Cuban troops, and Eastern European technicians are dispatched to Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and South Yemen. The USSR provides arms, training, and economic assistance to Vietnam, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. These interventions are partly ideological, partly strategic, aimed at expanding Soviet influence and denying the West access to resources and strategic positions. But they are also expensive and often ineffective. Local conflicts prove resistant to Soviet solutions. Allies prove unreliable. The costs mount without commensurate benefits. The most catastrophic foreign policy decision of the Brezhnev era comes in December 1979, when Soviet forces invade Afghanistan. The decision is made by a small group of aging leaders, including Brezhnev, who is by this point in declining health, suffering from the effects of strokes, and dependent on medications. The Soviet leadership believes the intervention will be brief, a matter of stabilizing a friendly government and preventing the spread of Islamic fundamentalism to the Soviet Union's Central Asian republics. The initial invasion force of approximately 30,000 troops enters Afghanistan on December 25, 1979. They quickly seize control of Kabul and other major cities, install a new government under Babrak Karmal, and expect the situation to stabilize. Instead, the Soviet Union finds itself trapped in a brutal counterinsurgency war. The Mujahideen, armed and funded by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, wage a relentless guerrilla campaign. The Soviet military, designed to fight a conventional war in Europe, proves ill-suited to the mountains and villages of Afghanistan. Soldiers are ambushed on remote roads, bases are attacked, helicopters are shot down. The war drags on year after year, consuming resources, destroying morale, and producing a steady stream of coffins returning to the Soviet Union. The official media maintains silence or reports victories, but soldiers return with stories of the war's futility and horror. The Afghanistan War becomes the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a bleeding wound that undermines confidence in the system and exposes the gap between official propaganda and reality. By the late 1970s, the contradictions of the Brezhnev system are becoming unsustainable. Economic growth slows and then stagnates. The oil boom that financed the social contract is coming to an end. The population is aging, and the workforce is no longer growing as rapidly. Alcoholism becomes a national crisis, with consumption reaching levels that affect productivity and public health. Life expectancy for Soviet men begins to decline, an almost unprecedented phenomenon in an industrialized country during peacetime. The technological gap with the West widens. While the Soviet Union can match the United States in nuclear weapons and heavy industry, it falls behind in computers, electronics, telecommunications, and consumer goods. The command economy cannot generate the innovation required for the emerging information age. The political system ossifies along with the economy. Brezhnev and the generation of leaders who came to power with him age in place, clinging to their positions, unwilling or unable to make way for younger leaders with new ideas. The Politburo becomes a gerontocracy, a council of old men whose primary concern is maintaining their privileges and avoiding change. Brezhnev himself, once vigorous and politically astute, declines into a figure of public embarrassment. He suffers strokes and becomes increasingly dependent on medications and alcohol. His speeches are slurred and confused. He falls asleep during meetings. He collects medals and awards with an almost pathological obsession, eventually accumulating over 200 decorations, including 5 Orders of Lenin and the Lenin Peace Prize. The personality cult around Brezhnev becomes a subject of jokes and cynicism. The gap between the official image of the wise, beloved leader and the reality of a declining, medicated old man becomes impossible to ignore. Corruption flourishes at every level of Soviet society during the Brezhnev era. The General Secretary's own family is implicated in scandals. His daughter Galina is involved with a circus performer and a criminal network that smuggles diamonds. The so-called cotton affair in Uzbekistan reveals a massive scheme in which officials falsify production figures and pocket the money allocated for cotton that was never grown. The scandal implicates thousands of officials and reaches into the highest levels of the Uzbek party apparatus. Brezhnev protects his allies and limits the investigation, but the rot is evident. The system is eating itself from within, as officials at every level use their positions to enrich themselves and their families, knowing that loyalty to the party and to each other will shield them from consequences. Yet, even as the system decays, most Soviet citizens continue to live their lives, finding moments of happiness, raising families, pursuing careers within the constraints of the system. There is pride in Soviet achievements, in having defeated Nazi Germany, in being a superpower, in the accomplishments of Soviet science and culture. There is also resignation, cynicism, and the development of a parallel world of private life where people retreat from the demands of official ideology. The kitchen becomes the space for honest conversation, where friends gather to drink, to talk, to share jokes and complaints, to speak truths that cannot be spoken in public. A kind of internal emigration takes place, where people maintain the outward forms of conformity while cultivating an inner life separate from the state. The Brezhnev era ends not with revolution or dramatic collapse, but with the slow, almost imperceptible exhaustion of a system that has lost the capacity for renewal. On November 10, 1982, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev dies at the age of 75. His death is officially attributed to a heart attack, though his health had been deteriorating for years. His funeral is a state occasion, attended by leaders from around the world, a final display of Soviet power and prestige. But even as the old guard buries their leader, the contradictions he left unresolved are accelerating toward crisis. The Soviet Union has 18 months of life left, as Brezhnev's immediate successors, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, both elderly and ill, briefly hold power before dying in turn. It is only with the ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev in March 1985 that the attempt at reform begins, reforms that will ultimately bring down the entire system. The legacy of the Brezhnev era is complex and contested. For some, particularly those who lived through the chaos of the 1990s, it represents a lost golden age of stability, security, and superpower status. For others, it represents stagnation, missed opportunities, and the squandering of the Soviet Union's potential. What is undeniable is that the choices made during the Brezhnev years, the decision to prioritize stability over reform, to maintain the command economy rather than adapt to changing conditions, to suppress dissent rather than engage with criticism, to expand military power while neglecting consumer needs, created conditions that made the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union nearly inevitable. The Brezhnev era was the long, slow decline disguised as stability. The moment when the Soviet Union stopped believing in its own future while continuing to insist on its inevitable triumph. It was an era of contradictions that could not be resolved within the framework of the system itself, and those contradictions would ultimately prove fatal.